Frequent listeners will know that I am based in New York City, which has a pretty bad housing crisis. But an even worse housing crisis than New York exists in London, where rents are incredibly out of control. How did London, and really the entire United Kingdom, get into such a severe housing crisis? And what can be done to fix it? Freddie Poser is the executive director of Priced Out, which is the UK's largest, most important pro-housing advocacy group. He joins the podcast to discuss the history of the UK's planning process, where opposition to housing comes from, and how Keir Starmer might be the best hope for real change and for adding more housing. As always, thank you for listening to the podcast. If you want to drop us a like, a comment, a subscription, a recommendation, anything like that is helpful. If you really enjoyed the podcast, please consider supporting us. You can do so at patreon.com/newliberalpodcast. You can also support us by becoming a member of the Center for New Liberalism at cnliberalism.org/become a member. Get involved with the Center for New Liberalism, get access to bonus episodes that no one else gets, become a member of our Sticker of the Month Club. All of that could be yours. Support us today. We would greatly appreciate it. We always appreciate you listening to the podcast. So thank you and enjoy the episode. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the New Liberal Podcast, part of the Center for New Liberalism. I'm your host, Jeremiah Johnson, and joining me this episode is Freddie Poser. Freddie, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So we have a lot of listeners who obviously care a lot about housing, a lot about the housing crisis, but most of our listeners are in America. We have a lot of listeners all over the world, and I think it's interesting to get to do this, to talk about the housing crisis in a different context from what we normally see it in America, from what we normally see in, San Francisco or Los Angeles or New York, or even some of the smaller cities in America where this is still becoming an issue. From a high level view, Freddie, could you describe housing policy in the UK and the state of the housing crisis you have going on in, England, Scotland, Wales, everywhere in the UK right now? What's it like from somebody who's not there and who may be curious about this, but doesn't know much to begin with?
Absolutely. So a lot of the broad strokes are incredibly similar in the UK to as they are in the States. The fundamental issue is we haven't built enough homes for 40 years or more in this country. And as a direct consequences, the price both to buy a home but also to rent a home in our major cities has gone through the roof. And in that way, it's exactly like what you see in San Francisco, New York, where places with significant economic activity, economic growth, have seen their prices go up and up, and the supply hasn't responded for political reasons. It hasn't been allowed to respond to the increased demand.
There's a real sort of solidarity among Anglophone countries where we've all got the same terrible crisis going on, and it's probably the wrong kind of solidarity to have, but
Absolutely. It does feel like the Anglophone countries are the absolute worst at this. But what's different in the UK is obviously we've got a completely different political environment, a different set of laws that govern how houses are permitted, and how we have something called planning permission rather than permitting here, and we don't really have zoning. But a lot of the underlying political dynamics, the NIMBYism and the sort of the legal barriers to building new homes, those are absolutely the same or exist here as well.
I'm curious about the no zoning part, because that's something in America, zoning is this great villain. There's a nightmarishly complex zoning codes in most cities, and it's not nationalized. So, New York has something like 2,000 different zones, and Los Angeles will have 3,000 zones, and they don't intersect in any way. So it's just every city is its own little different nightmare. And so a lot of people think, well, if we could just get rid of zoning, or if we could simplify zoning, that would solve the problem. But it's interesting to hear you say that, there's no zoning in the UK or something to that effect. But obviously the problem is still quite bad.
Yeah, so we don't have a zonal system. We have development control, and we have very strict development control, but it isn't this area and draw a shape on a map. That is for this type of industrial use, and you can build, or this area is single family homes. We have a more discretionary system, which is based on the idea that you want to build something, you need to come to your local planning authority, which is generally your local council, and you say, I want to build this here, and then they will consider your application, and they will say yes or no. To make it more complicated, we have these things called local development plans. So every council has to draw a plan for its area, looking into the future, what sort of things can go where, what policies. That's constrained by national level legislation as well. But we don't have this sort of zoning system where this area is for this type. The discretionary aspect means that one of the disadvantages from a developer's point of view is it's quite hard to know with certainty what's going to be allowed or not. Where, okay, I want to bring forward 100 homes, say, on this site. You can't look at the zoning code and say, well, this is at least zoned for that. You'll go, well, maybe it is. Here are some policies in the local plan that are vaguely in favour. Here are some that might be slightly against this development. And then you have to put your case to the council. You have to go to a planning committee. They will decide, and then you can appeal that up to the national government, to the planning inspectorate. And there are all these layers and different ways and 100 different policies and 1,000,000 different reports you need to write. But there isn't a zoning system. So it is interesting to hear Americans talk about zoning when I think, in America, the issue is the zoning code, but actually the reason is not because it's zoning, the issue is because it's strict zoning. It's designed to slow down housing delivery. In the UK, we don't really have zoning, but our system is still designed to slow things from being built.
Yeah, I think the goal for a lot of people is, by right building, where just if something fits inside the zoning code, then we can just build it by right without really asking for permission, without really having to get, 14 different approvals. You submit your paperwork, you say, look, this fits within the code of the zoning regulation, and boom, I'm going to build it. And obviously, in an ideal world, that would lead to a lot of building. But what you're describing is more discretionary, that, case by case basis, every single thing has to be approved. And obviously that gets into, a political quagmire sometimes. I'm curious, has this always been the case? Has it always been that this, system has kind of discouraged development, or was there a time when the UK actually was building a lot of housing? What's the history like here? Because I'm coming in knowing very little about the history of house building in the UK.
Well, so the history of house building is long and complicated, as with many things in UK history. But yes, the UK did build a lot of homes before the First World War, in the 1930s, and then in the sort of 50s and 60s. And the UK did build a lot of homes.
And obviously 50s and 60s, and I guess late 40s as well. But the UK was recovering from a fairly brutal bombardment, especially in your most important capital city that drives all the economic growth of the UK.
Yeah,
there was special circumstances why they really needed to build stuff.
Yeah, I don't think Americans often don't understand quite how destroyed and poor Europe and the UK was after the Second World War. So, but we also, at the same time, we put into place our planning system in the aftermath of the Second World War, partially as a response to a lot of the building work. For a really good in-depth discussion of Britain's housing crisis, I highly recommend an article in Works in Progress by Sam Watling called Why Britain Doesn't Build, which, if you're the particular kind of nerd that I am, you'll find it fascinating, all about the legal and political changes behind this. But in a broad sense, in the aftermath of the Second World War, whilst we did have planning permission, it was relatively new, so it hadn't had all this time to accumulate all the things that slowed down building. And also there were attempts to do building because of the aftermath of the Second World War that were so important sort of in a national interest sense that they went through anyway. But actually a lot of the building post-war was still in potentially suboptimal places because of opposition to building. We got new towns, whole new areas that were added that new research is suggesting, was incredibly expensive compared to, say, building on the edge of London or densifying bits of London or major cities. And there was some crazy economic policies post-war where Britain deliberately tried to stymie the economic growth of certain cities because they thought they were growing too quickly. So we never really recovered to levels of private house building that we saw before the Second World War, once the 1947 Town and Country Planning Act, which is in our case, the sort of big cartoon villain. You have zoning, we have the Town and Country Planning Act.
Is this the I want to jump in for just a second because I'm very curious about kind of the comment about, they built a lot of houses, but they were placed in suboptimal areas. Is this what I hear about when I hear about Milton Keynes?
Ha! Yes. So
Milton Keynes, for listeners, is not just a portmanteau of two famous economists. It's not Milton Friedman and John Maynard Keynes, as is frequently confused on Twitter. It's actually this city in the UK that has this bizarre kind of history to me. And I frequently hear it used, like when I'm hanging out with British friends. It's like the punchline to a joke, usually.
So Milton Keynes is actually the good one. Milton Keynes was more successful than other new towns that were built in the aftermath. But yes, this policy called the New Towns Act allowed the government to come in and say, we're going to build a city here or a town here. We're going to put tens of thousands of homes here. And the sort of political rationale was, first, we need to build huge swathes of new homes. It would be incredibly unpopular generally to build those near people. So let's build them, hopefully, in the middle of not quite nowhere, because Britain's even then relatively dense, but away from major population centres, minimising the backlash while still delivering homes. The problem with this is, A, it's incredibly expensive to build a new town from scratch because you need to put all of the infrastructure in from scratch. There isn't an existing transportation, water, electricity infrastructure to piggyback on just to upgrade. You need to go from scratch. And these places were built in the 50s and 60s and 70s, and with all of the architectural and town planning thoughts and ideas that existed at that time. So today, I'm not sure we would call them architectural and town planning marvels. And then, however, the major issue is they fly in the face of economic geography, which is we need to be building these places where economic growth and opportunity and jobs are. So Milton Keynes isn't too bad. It's quite close to major cities in London, and the closer that you are to a major population centre, the better these new towns tended to perform. But especially the later ones, which were even further away from our major cities, were expensive, delivered housing, but not housing people particularly wanted to live in, and places that often have much, much lower average wages than, say, Birmingham or Manchester or Liverpool, are actual productive cities.
The flip side here is that there were places that you could have developed that, were almost the perfect spot for new housing, but they weren't because of opposition, whether at the very local level or even at the national level. What can you tell me about the Green Belt? I don't think that people from America or from elsewhere in the world necessarily know what a Green Belt is.
So in America, you would call what we call the Green Belt, you would call it an urban containment boundary or urban containment zone. And it is a policy where you draw a strip of land around a city, and basically every major city in England has one of these. You draw a strip of land around it, and you say, to all intents and purposes, no development here. England and London got its green belt in the 40s as well, though the actual thinking behind it comes from before the war. People, and it's a reaction to the growth of London. London grew incredibly quickly in the first half of the 20th century, modulo what happened in the two world wars, and there was significant opposition, and that local opposition bubbled up into a national opposition. And the idea was, if you contain the growth of the city, you stop urban sprawl. And people wanted to stop urban sprawl, especially people who lived on the edge of the city. The Greenbelt, as it exists today, has mutated. It is much bigger than it ever was. It can be miles wide and often can encompass more area, more Greenbelt area than there is city area for some cities, because of just the nature of area scaling with radius means that you draw a ring around Cambridge, which is not a big city, and you get more area in its greenbelt. This has a number of really negative effects. It absolutely strangulates the growth of cities that should be growing because you can't build in the greenbelt. It actually encourages leapfrog development, where you'll get development just on the edge of greenbelt, where
and by that you mean like not inside the greenbelt,
yes.
but outside the greenbelt, so that there's almost like a second big city kind of growing up right on the boundary of on the outside of where you're allowed to build, kind of at the edge of London's area.
But absolutely not a big city, sort of hundreds of homes, not thousands even. Because that's, people still want to be next to, say, Cambridge in this case. They have to, but they can't build in the Greenbelt or Birmingham or similar. Actually, in the north, it's led to the fact that cities that are really close together, that should really be growing towards each other, can't, because they're separated by these boundaries. But in London especially, you get this leapfrog development where people are building, as you say, outside the green belt, but to be closer to London. And then because of the fact that it's quite easy, not super easy, but quite easy for a council to designate new land as green belt, to say this land is now green belt, they can use it, or at least the cynic in me would say they use it to get out of having to build there by saying, oh, no, that's now green belt. Some of the discourse that those more plugged into the British version of YIMBY Twitter will recognise is what the leader of the opposition here, Keir Starmer, has termed grey belt, which is, the green belt is actually potentially a misleading name because it suggests that it's England's green and pleasant land. It could be this lovely verdant countryside that is unspoilt. But it's just a legal designation. In fact, large areas of the green belt may well have been developed on and were just called green belt because someone was drawing a shape on a map. So even land that is not green can be green belt, and it still can't be built on for housing, or it's much, much harder to get housing built on that land.
A depressing kind of paved over green belt.
Absolutely. One example that a journalist here raised a couple of months ago was a disused petrol station, a gas station, as you would call it.
I wonder if there's some sort of like devil's advocate case for the green belt, because I can see like it's a nice idea to say that, well, cities should be very dense. We should build within the city rather than letting it sprawl. I certainly don't like urban sprawl. I would prefer to have very dense cities. And, there's kind of there's a meme in YIMBY circles of like, if you have an island with like 100 spaces, you could build 100 single family homes, or you could just build a tower with 100 homes and the rest of the island gets to continue being nature. And to some extent, I think this is correct, that the denser we can build, the more we can, to save nature and save the countryside and all that. But so in that sense, I think like, well, green belts could be good policy. I think where we're potentially falling short, and you can correct me, is that you institute the green belt and then you also don't build inside the green belt.
I think that's basically right, that a version of the green belt designed to encourage denser urban development would work, or could work, certainly, where what you're saying is actually we want people to live transport accessible lives for the benefits are numerous, from climate to health to economic growth. So we should be encouraging denser, contiguous urban development that is good for the city. And a version of the Greenbelt that, for example, was allowed Greenbelt release in specific places where they were transport accessible, but otherwise the policy allowed it to be easier to densify inside the Greenbelt. That might work a lot better. The issue is that a lot of these development control systems aren't designed. They're designed to stop development because that's the political incentive. They're political schemes. So you don't see.
Well, let's talk about those politics for a little bit, because NIMBYism exists in a lot of places. The core reason why it's hard to build is that people don't want you to build. And sometimes this is a large group of people. Sometimes this is a small but very dedicated group of people who are opposed to building. I'm curious how NIMBYism asserts itself in the UK context. What are the typical demographic markers of somebody who's a NIMBY? What kind of arguments are they making against building? What is the nature of their opposition? And is this most people in the UK are against new housing, or a dedicated minority? How would you kind of build up the story of what's happening with NIMBYs in your country?
So a lot of it comes from the fact that at a certain point, we're going backwards on this for the housing crisis reasons, but the UK got to a very high percentage of home ownership. I can't remember exactly how high, but after Margaret Thatcher had been Prime Minister, one of the results of her premiership and later administrations was that home ownership skyrocketed, and Britain became a property-owning democracy. NIMBYism, I think, in many ways is simply specific actors acting in their rational self-interest, because once you own your home, there is little reason for you to want new homes built near you. You experience real cost to those homes being built. But broadly speaking, in the UK, development has been widely unpopular up until quite recently. The government has frequently tried things to go, we're going to build more homes, we're going to get a grip on the housing crisis. And that's both parties. And each time there's been significant backlash to building new homes near existing population centres.
And is this, you mentioned kind of the rational self-interest thing. If you're a homeowner, building more homes might cause you to experience a loss of value. But beyond that, is this also just a genuine kind of preference? Like, people don't want to live near, they say they don't want to live near other people, or is it a sort of faux environmentalism, or like what are the stated reasons?
So I think actually loss of value, I don't mean in sort of house price from fixing the housing crisis. I mean that it's really annoying if there's construction near you for 3 years, or if something that was a field, let's say you're in a smaller town and suddenly it's 300 homes, there's a significant loss of amenity there. In terms of the stated values, it's all the same thing you'll see in the States. It's a lot of environmentalism. I agree with you, fake environmentalism, but it's a lot of environmentalism, green space, that sort of thing. There are varying degrees of genuine and less genuine concerns about traffic, public services, doctors, that sort of thing. I'd say those are some of the classics you hear. If it happens in the US, you probably hear it here. You often find people with incredibly expensive homes arguing against homes for first-time buyers, or they'd argue that the homes are too small, no one would ever want to live in it. You need homes for families, and then you see them arguing against larger homes because they're too expensive and they're executive homes. So you'll find arguments against any
Is that
development.
is executive homes the UK coded version of, well, those aren't apartments I can afford, those are luxury apartments?
We have that too. Executive homes
I've never heard executive homes before.
Executive homes tends to refer to a sort of 4-bedroom home or so. We have really small properties in the UK, even outside of our major city. We have some of the smallest properties in Europe. But we also get the luxury home where what people see is like, that home's really expensive, no one can afford it. And you go, well, your home costs almost exactly the same amount as that. So you live in a luxury home by your definition. But so yeah, people don't. So if you hear it in the States, you'll probably hear it here in the UK as well.
So that tells us kind of what people are thinking and why they oppose new housing, the people who are kind of protesting this or just unhappy about it. But I'm also curious kind of the mechanisms that are used to stop it. I've done a lot of these episodes for different states in the US. We did an episode on Montana YIMBYism and, trying to build more housing in California and New York. And in a lot of these places, there's kind of very different mechanisms that are used to stop new housing. In one place, it might be extensive environmental reviews. Well, something looks like it might get built, but then you throw an environmental review requirement at them that stops it for 4 years while they investigate some nematode that, might live in the area. In other places, it's really crazy parking requirements. We need 3 parking spaces for every apartment because that's what the code says. And so there's always these kind of different manifestations of like, how does housing actually get stopped? Do you see anything like that in the UK? Is it just straight up, well, the Planning Commission tells you no? Or is it more of a flavor of, well, you can build if you do all this stuff, and then it makes it functionally impossible? Is there any kind of local flavor there?
A bit of all of the above. We certainly have a lot of areas and local planning authorities that under allocate in their local plan, drag their heels through the planning process and say no to things a lot. We also have that at a national level. We have a very centralized planning system in many ways. The Secretary of State, our equivalent of our cabinet minister for housing, can call in any planning application in the country and decide it, yes or no, which
really?
Would be unheard of.
That's incredible. Yeah, in the US, that would be, first of all, that would be incredible because all we'd have to do is get one of our people in there and just say yes to everything.
It is, unless you lose and then they say no to everything. But so it's not used super often, but all sorts of schemes are decided by that process is called call-in, where it's called in to the Secretary of State. So you get just very restrictive local areas and local plans and planning committees that won't say yes. And then we also have that sort of death by 1,000 cuts approach as well, where regulations will make it less and less viable to build projects. Some of those regulations start out with the best of intentions and they just add up to incredible burdens on the size and type and layout of places you can build. And then some of them are just less justifiable, should we say. One example recently was building in about 75 local authorities across the country. So a significant proportion of the country was banned. All new homes were banned there because of an issue with something called nutrient neutrality, which is about pollution in rivers. Now, whilst the pollution in rivers is certainly an issue, the response was, oh, no new housing in those areas, which became a political football in the country for a little while. So that's one example. We also hear about building requirements. So in London especially, there's a huge list of rules that you have to comply with, our equivalent of building codes, which aren't just safety rules. They're things like minimum space requirements. Your flat needs to point in 2 different directions. So that's called a dual aspect rule. Rules on where you can put the windows, how much solar gain needs to be accounted for. All of these stuff make it less and less profitable to build those houses. Add on that then requirements for affordable housing, and it means that even if you get permission, it can be incredibly touch or go to build in even the most expensive areas because of all these little rules. So we don't have parking requirements, but we do have a British flavour of it.
Yeah, and I really appreciate the point about, each of these comes in with good intentions, potentially, but, you add, 500 different little burdens to the process of building housing, each of which you might say on its own sounds reasonable, but at the end you've got 500 different requirements and it's not profitable to build housing and nobody will build it. And now you're in a crisis.
Absolutely. So as I say, some of them are justifiable on their own. Some of them are well-intentioned, but I would say misguided. And some of them are slightly out there. There was one that got a lot of derision in the UK where one council voted that every new building had to have something called a bee brick, which was to save the bees. They had to put special bricks in that helped save the bees or something. And obviously that adds a cost to the development, making it harder to build in that particular local environment. And
this sounds like one of those things that, just from an American perspective, I apologize, but it sounds like one of those British things that's made up.
No,
we all have bee bricks over here in Britain. Haven't you ever heard of that?
No, you have you have no idea how bad things really are over here. Yeah.
Well, in some sense, look, I live in New York, I am no stranger to expensive housing, but London is in many ways, I think, even worse than New York.
Certainly relative to the salaries in New York, it is a lot worse. Is part of the galling thing. We have almost as high rents and none of the high salaries. So we've got the worst of both worlds.
The people who conquered half the world and now can't conquer a planning commission, man. It's crazy.
Absolutely, and I think that we've got this. It's a really difficult system to overcome because a lot of those rules they seem good because who wouldn't want everyone to have lots of space and so we'll do a minimum space for new flats, and then who wouldn't want everyone to be able to ventilate their flat from two angles, so we'll put in a dual aspect rule, and then who wouldn't want to take account of solar gain, the amount of heating from the sun, so we'll do that. And then you talk to a developer about the amount of work it is not just to get that right, but then to prove in yet another review and yet another document that you have done that work, which runs to thousands and thousands of pages. One example, this isn't housing, but in the UK, we're trying to build a road, which you'd think shouldn't be too difficult. We're trying to build the Lower Thames crossing, a tunnel under the Thames to carry a new motorway, highway, as you would call it. And we have spent more money on the planning inquiry than Norway spent building the longest tunnel in the world. We haven't built not a shovel in the ground. We have spent £300 million, just one bit of government asking a different bit of government if it can build a road.
I mean, that sounds like I write a lot about the National Environmental Protection Act here in the U.S., and some of these environmental reviews go for thousands of pages, and it's the same thing. Just how much time and money is wasted. Even more than the money sometimes is the time, because time, America's got tons of money, but just these things are delayed for years and years, and you never get anything built. And I don't know, it's crazy, but I do want to shift the conversation here now, because we've talked a lot about policy. We've talked a lot about how people feel and the history and the particular policy details. But one unavoidable part of this we haven't talked about much yet is the politics involved. Can you tell me maybe a little bit of history first? Historically, has one of the two parties, and we can even talk about the Lib Dems here as well, how have the parties kind of aligned themselves with housing? Has it typically been something where the parties differ at all, or are they pretty united? What's the deal there with Labour, the Lib Dems, the Tories? How do they approach this issue?
So there are lots of angles on that. as you might expect, on something like on social housing, on sort of publicly built and government owned and let housing, there are stark differences between how the Conservatives and Labour, for example, have historically viewed those projects and how they've thought about them and the policies they've implemented with regards to them. When it comes to planning, though, I don't think you can easily put the blame on one party or another. Often you'll find at a local election, whichever party runs the council will be being attacked by the party that doesn't for building too many homes, because it's very easy. It's an easy win in opposition to attack based on NIMBYism. And that goes as well for the Lib Dems, who tend to be much more local. So they do a lot of this where they attack based on these sort of anti-development, because that's the big issue in the local area. It's not some guiding ideology in any way for any of the parties. That's where the votes are in the local area.
It was very disappointing for me the first time that I realized, like, the Lib Dems in the UK seem to be, at least from my outside perspective, some of the biggest NIMBYs that exist. Is instances of like local Lib Dems, and I was just like, oh, I kind of thought better of you guys, you know?
Yeah, well, I think it's part and parcel with with struggling to win at the national level, meaning that local politics is so important within the Lib Dems but it's not fair to put it only on the Lib Dems. It is all major parties will engage at this at a local level. To this day, at a national level, it's more complicated. Generally, both Labour and the Conservatives have at various times tried to build more homes. Tony Blair had ideas for how to do this, and the coalition government and later the Tory government also have tried their approaches, be it regional planning, local planning, changes to trying to move to a flexible zoning system, community land auctions. We've all done, there are loads of ideas people have tried and basically worked or not worked. Have failed politically, regardless of how the policy has gone through, because each time it becomes, where there's major house building, it becomes a very hot button issue, and there are groups that campaign just almost entirely against building homes in the UK. So it's interesting now, at this election, Keir Starmer, who's the Labour Party leader, has set out his stall, being very pro-house building. He's declared himself a YIMBY. He's stated that he will get Britain building again. It remains to be seen the policies he's going to propose for that and how that will happen if and when he becomes Prime Minister. But he has clearly set out a stall in favour of house building at a high rhetorical level. And we'll see where that goes. And that will mark quite a big national divergence, and I think speaks to how much of an issue this has become in the UK over the last year. This has really risen up the national agenda. So we'll see one major theme at this election, which should be this year, we think. I know Americans always find that kind of crazy that we don't necessarily know when our elections are going to be, but we think it will probably be this year.
Yeah, it should be this year. And by the way, I do think it's very funny that you and I will both probably just correctly assume Keir Starmer will be in charge. Like, there doesn't seem to be much doubt about that anymore.
Not even the Tories here also assume that to be true as well.
Yeah. And so, look, this is an ideological podcast. I have a point of view. And so I'm a big fan of Keir Starmer. You know, I'm a big fan of kind of the direction that Labour has taken, that they're no longer going in a Corbynite direction, and that Keir Starmer seems like a very smart guy who's whipping Labour into shape. And I'm not going to pretend to be unbiased. I am who I am. So I want to believe very good things about Keir Starmer. I did see that Priced Out just released kind of a statement, towards Keir Starmer, where it seemed like, there's a little bit of, I don't know how to say, a little bit of pro and con. He said some good things, but then also his shadow secretary for housing development has given off some worrying signs. Can you tell us about that? Like, what was the letter you guys released, and how worried are you that, some of Keir Starmer's shadow government might be actually leaning in an anti-housing direction?
So I think I am also very hopeful for Keir Starmer's likely premiership. I think that he has said a lot of really good things. We exist as a campaign group, a cross-party campaign group, to praise things that are good on house building and call out things that are bad on house building on all sides. I think one of the differences between the UK and the US is there's also more, the parties are closer. There's much more of an idea that you could work with all the parties. We don't have quite the history of such division between the two parties. So we will praise the government, the Tory government, when it does stuff that we think is good, and we will go after them relatively ruthlessly when they do things that are anti-house building. And I see Priced Out's role as doing similarly. Even, we're not going to give him too much slack. We're going to praise him for his rhetoric. In this case, his shadow minister for housing, Matthew Pennycook, who I've no reason to think doesn't want to have more homes built, said that he didn't think that granting more planning permission would build more homes. We're very clear that the only way we're going to get these new homes we need is to grant more planning permissions, and we think that Keir Starmer also believes that. So our letter was simply pointing out that we were hoping that Keir Starmer sticks to what he said on this, that he wants to see more planning permission granted, especially for what we call brownfield development, which is roughly building on land that's already been built on once before. So urban densification, or taking ex-industrial sites and turning it into housing.
Or unused petrol stations.
Absolutely.
I'm curious about the amount of political energy and amount of political will that it will take to get this done. You've mentioned that, other governments have thought about this. Tony Blair had a plan. David Cameron had a plan. I'm sure technically Rishi Sunak has a plan, RIP to him and the other 12 conservative prime ministers that have come in the last year. But apparently those plans aren't working. And it's probably because there's either, a lack of concrete execution. It might just be that they're not smart enough, which I don't really believe. Or it might just be that there's not enough political will. This issue doesn't actually motivate enough people. There's not enough people who would actually punish the government for not doing it. And so they talk a big game and then they don't do anything. So when Keir Starmer comes in, I guess I'm just asking, is this grown in importance to such a level where people really will hold him to account over, what is the price of my rent? Are rents going down in London? Are they going down in Manchester and Birmingham? Is this really rising to a level of national anger? And is Starmer going to have the political will and desire to actually make tough decisions that might make some people angry and actually get things done?
I really hope so. And if he can do that, he will be an incredibly influential prime minister. It is important now that we, as Priced Out and lots of groups, we're looking at, well, what could he do? Because houses, quite frankly, take a long time to build. 5 years is not a long time to actually come up with a policy, pass a policy, make it law, and then have it work. So not just building homes, but building homes quickly is a genuinely difficult policy question. But yes, I think that there is a really large constituency now, not just of his voters, but of the people who are activists. The activist base is young. A lot of them are based in major cities that have a housing crisis. And they want to see this action from Keir Starmer. So I think if he fails on this point, he'll struggle at the next election to put forward a stall on house building, because we've had decades of promises and failure, and he really shouldn't want to end up there as like all the others.
I see a kind of political opportunity here, and I'm going to give a very amateurish level of like analysis of UK politics. So please forgive me, the American who says he knows things about UK politics. But what I do just notice is that there's huge age gaps in the UK in terms of party voting intention. That, you know, older people tend to be more conservative, as is most the case most places in the world. But especially among young people, the splits between Labour and the Tories are just comical. It's 90-10 or 95-5 or something crazy like that. And so, you know, young people are the people who, as you've said, these are not people who mostly own their own home. They are not the homeowner generation when you're only 25 years old and you've grown up in a housing crisis. You are not that previous generation of Britain who had, you know, the chance to buy their own home. You're young, you're a renter, your rent as compared to your salary is obscene. Most of you live in major cities. You know, you might be well educated, but you feel like you're not doing as well as you should, you know, because of the state of the economy. I think there's a real chance here if Starmer can actually like turn pro housing, you know, pro building into kind of a signature Labour thing, that you could really like lock up housing as a Labour issue that people just trust, you know, in the same way that like people tend to trust the Tories more on one issue, or maybe they trust Labour more on the NHS or something like that. You can just turn housing into a Labour issue where for a generation, people will trust you more on that. You know, I don't know if I'm just wish casting here, but the age gap there makes me think it's possible.
I'm sure that people in Labour HQ right now are having the exact same hopes and thoughts, because certainly someone who solves this issue will, or could, as you say, make that his policy for decades to come. The signature achievement could be solving the UK housing crisis, and with it, the huge foregone economic gains that we could bring back by actually solving the housing crisis. But
yeah, because the UK is, you know, struggling economically ever since Brexit, and I don't think it's just because of Brexit. Brexit probably didn't help, but you know, since Brexit, the UK has just struggled along and has not had much economic growth at all. And you know, you've got to kickstart the economy. One fast and easy way to do that, right, is just to get more people in your productive areas. You know, London is a more productive city in an economic sense than many of the rural areas of the country. And why can't we just have more people living there?
Absolutely. So I think the economic argument is incredibly important, in addition to the bring down my rent argument, because the work of academics point out that one of the things a city is for is being this hypermobile, large pool of skilled labor. And that drives up wages for multiple reasons, not least the agglomeration effects that seem to happen when you have large groups of people living near each other. And it drives these productivity growth. And we see that at the moment, London and the Southeast are actually the only places that have this significant economic growth. So by fixing the housing crisis, both in London and in our other cities, we should kickstart the economy, as you say, and that's actually good for the whole country. That's crucial for the whole country. A lot of this applies mostly to England here, because we have a devolved system here where Scotland and Wales have a lot more power over their own housing policy. So it's a lot of this is different for Scotland, where the SNP are in charge. But in England,
do they actually build a lot of housing in Scotland and Wales? Do they have the same level of crisis?
They've got it's a very different situation, but they have similar issues, but especially in Edinburgh, as I understand it. But their politics is sufficiently different that actually, so in Wales, a lot of the issue is not a lack of building because of a lack of permission. It's sort of old homes that need replacing, where it's actually trying to find the investment to improve the stock, especially in rural areas. And that's true in rural areas in England as well. But Cardiff, Edinburgh, Glasgow, yes, they do also have maybe slightly less severe, but they also have housing crises like London, Manchester, Birmingham, Liverpool.
Yeah. And I don't know anything about Northern Ireland, but I definitely know that Dublin and most of the rest of Ireland, as long as we're just talking about Anglophone countries, Dublin has potentially even worse than London, which I don't know how that's possible, but I see stories from friends in Ireland where it's like there's an apartment being shown, 500 people show up, and it turns out, oh, well, they already rented it before the 500. Like, it's insane
I think
in Dublin.
Dublin's might be the worst in the Western world, which is incredible. It's definitely up there with London, New York, the Bay Area in the severity of its housing shortage. For many of the same reasons as we see in the UK. Ireland has a relatively similar, at least in origin, system to the UK. It's obviously Irish law, and it's not exactly the same, but it certainly echoes what's happened in the UK.
So we're coming up on time. I want to ask the traditional question that we ask everyone on this podcast as our final question, which is, where can people go to learn more? If they're interested in what we're talking about today, the history of planning in the UK, or the politics involved in building more housing in England, in London's, housing market, in any of the stuff that we're talking about, what would you recommend for them to learn more? This could be people to follow on Twitter. This could be a white paper, a book, a blog post, just anything that you think would be helpful for people who want to continue learning about this.
Well, absolutely. Well, they should follow me, obviously. So I think the piece...
Follow the personal, Freddie Poser, and also Priced Out UK. Follow both.
Absolutely. But the piece I mentioned earlier, Why Britain Doesn't Build, in Works in Progress by Sam Watling, is, I think, the definitive essay on the history of the British planning system and how we got from the 1940s to here. So I think that's a really great introduction, and thinks about it in a way that sets you up to think about what solutions might work and what solutions are probably just going to get us doing this again in 10 years if we don't get it right this time and we lose the argument again and we lose the votes again, we're going to be back here in 10 years. So I think that's a great piece.
All right. Well, I certainly hope we get more housing built everywhere, in New York, in London, everywhere that needs housing. Let's just make it easier to build. I want to thank my guest one more time for coming on the show, Freddie Poser.
Thank you so much for having me.